Did you see my last YouTube video? Well, I nearly didn't post it. It was just me sitting down talking, a bit like this, to be honest. And it wasn't very well prepared, and it certainly wasn't scripted. I rambled quite a lot. And I just thought that it wasn't really good enough to put online. I knew that if I prepared a bit more, I could probably come up with a better video. But then I realised that was part of the problem. You see, I'd already spent quite a long time waiting to be ready to come back to YouTube. And I realised that I was making excuses, telling myself that the video had to be perfect in order to publish. And it definitely wasn't perfect. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't exactly polished. And then I thought to myself, Joe, publish it anyway. So I did. And afterwards, it made me think about something that I see English learners doing all the time. And that's waiting until their English feels better or good enough, until they start properly using it. Perhaps you're doing that too. You might be waiting until you know more vocabulary, until you feel more confident in your pronunciation or your grammar. You might be waiting until you hesitate less. You might be waiting until you stop making mistakes, in which case you might be waiting a very long time. But think about this. What if your English is actually already good enough to have a meaningful conversation with someone, even if it doesn't feel good enough to you? How can you tell if you genuinely need to learn more English, or whether what you actually need is the experience of using the English you already have? That's what I want to explore in today's video. We're going to look at what good enough actually means, why learning can sometimes become a way of avoiding speaking, what fluency looks like in an actual conversation, and why in the age of AI, your own imperfect English may be more valuable than you realise. What does good enough actually mean? When I say that your English may already be good enough, I'm not saying that it's perfect. Nobody's English is perfect. I'm not saying that you have nothing left to learn. And I'm definitely not saying that your English is suitable for every imaginable occasion or situation. It depends on what you need to do. The English you need to have a relaxed conversation over coffee isn't necessarily the same English as you might need to give an academic presentation or negotiate a complicated contract or pass a proficiency exam. There may be some situations that you're not prepared for yet, but that doesn't mean you're not ready for any of them. Before making one enormous judgment about whether your English is good enough, it might be useful to recognise what your English already allows you to do. For example, you're watching this video. You may not understand every single word, but can you follow the general argument? Could you give your opinion on this subject if I gave you a little bit of time to think? You might not be able to express yourself as precisely or elegantly as you can in your first language, but would you be able to communicate the general idea? And then what happens when you don't know a particular word? Can you describe it, give an example, or find another way to get the meaning across? When you speak English, can people understand you, even when your grammar or pronunciation aren't completely perfect? If you can do most of those things, then there will obviously still be areas in which you could improve your English. But a lack of knowledge may not be the reason that you're avoiding conversations. There's a difference between not having enough English to communicate and not trusting yourself to use the English you already have. And I think a lot of intermediate to advanced learners sometimes confuse these two things. You may understand huge amounts of English when you're reading or listening. You might know lots of grammar and vocabulary. There's a good chance that you've been learning English on and off for years. But then accessing all that knowledge during a live conversation is completely different. Learning a new word is one thing. Finding that word when somebody's waiting for you to finish your sentence is an entirely different thing. Maybe you can understand a grammar rule perfectly well in an exercise, but then you can completely lose track of your tenses when you're telling a story or when you're in a conversation listening out for what the other person is saying. trying to work out what you're going to say next. You might understand almost everything in a podcast, but that doesn't necessarily prepare you for answering a question that you weren't expecting. Real conversations are really unpredictable. You don't know what the other person is going to say. You can't plan out all your answers in advance, and you can't hit pause on a conversation so that you can find exactly the right word. And that's one of the things that makes conversation interesting, but it's also one of the things that can make it feel really vulnerable. So it makes sense that you might prefer to stay in this kind of safer world of preparation. I've called this bit learning as a hiding place. And by that, I mean perhaps you listen to a lot of podcasts or learn lots of vocabulary lists or spend a lot of time revising grammar points. And all this stuff can be genuinely valuable and useful. I'm certainly not going to tell you to stop learning new English, but sometimes this kind of learning can be a way of actively avoiding that uncomfortable experience of using it, speaking English. You could spend years preparing to speak English without ever feeling prepared to speak English. Another podcast or a YouTube video might teach you 10 useful expressions. And yeah, there is some value in that. I've made those videos myself. But what it can't do is give you the valuable experience of forgetting one of these expressions, but at the same time of staying in the conversation and discovering you can communicate without it. A grammar exercise can tell you whether you've got the correct tense, but it can't show you that another person can understand what you're saying perfectly well, even though the tense is incorrect. Sometimes when somebody says, I need to improve my English, that's exactly what they mean. There are gaps in their knowledge that make communication difficult. But sometimes they mean something different. Sometimes they mean, I don't feel comfortable letting somebody hear the English that I have now. And that's not simply a language problem. So what's really underneath it? I think all of the people that I work with are intelligent, bright, interesting adults with rich lives. In their first language, they're generally used to being able to communicate quite complicated ideas clearly. They can be funny, precise, spontaneous, subtle, witty. They tell a story without thinking about every sentence. They can slip in a quick joke. They can choose words that really reflect their personality and their particular way of looking at the world. Then they start speaking English and they feel like a sort of smaller version of themselves. They have to simplify what they want to say. The perfect response comes 10 minutes after the conversation has ended, and the joke doesn't come quickly enough. Or they begin explaining an interesting idea and lose the thread of what they were saying halfway through. And sometimes what comes out of their mouth doesn't sound anything like what they were thinking in their head. And that can be incredibly frustrating. You might not simply just be worried about making a grammatical mistake. It might be this deeper worry that you're concerned that somebody is mistaking your level of English for your level of intelligence, that you come across as quieter or a bit boring, or less capable than you really are. And in that kind of situation, you have less control over how people see you than you'd like. So when you say, my English isn't good enough, perhaps part of what you mean is, I don't feel like myself when I speak English. And if that's the real problem, learning 10 new phrasal verbs probably isn't going to solve it. More vocabulary is always useful to have in your toolkit. But you also need real experiences that show that you can still contribute, still be understood, and still connect with the person, even when your English doesn't come out quite as you'd hoped. So what does fluency actually look like? I see this quite often in my conversation sessions. Somebody will be telling me something interesting, and then they'll stop because they can't remember a particular word. And then they apologise and say something like, oh, sorry, my English is awful today. But then I'll encourage them to try and describe the word. They give me an example. Maybe I ask them a question. Perhaps I suggest a word. And maybe they say, yes, that's exactly what I meant. And then the conversation recovers and continues. For some learners, that feels like proof that their English has failed. But I see something completely different. They didn't have access in that moment to the particular word, so they found another way to communicate it. We collaborated a bit, and they stayed in the conversation. And this isn't failed communication. That is actually a conversational skill. And to the learner, that pause while they take a moment to think might feel enormous to them, but it barely registered with me. I definitely wasn't sitting there thinking, that's a very long pause. I was trying to think of the idea that they were trying to express. I was listening to that person, not judging their English. I think lots of us have an unrealistic idea of what fluency looks like. We can imagine somebody who is fluent as being somebody who speaks beautifully in well-composed sentences without pausing or hesitating, pronouncing every syllable perfectly, never repeating themselves, and never changing direction halfway through a sentence or forgetting what they were going to say. But listen to people speaking their first language. When we speak our first languages, we pause all the time. We forget words, especially when you get to my age. We start sentences and then abandon them halfway through because we can't remember what we were going to say. We use loads of filler words. The words that we speak are far from perfect. And sometimes we'll explain something quite badly and the other person won't understand. So we'll have to try and re-explain. Fluency doesn't mean that you never get stuck. Part of fluency is knowing what to do when you get stuck. It might mean saying something like, oh, I'm not sure of the word for, it's something you use for, or that's not exactly what I mean. Let me try and explain it a bit differently. Or simply something like, hang on a minute, just give me a minute to think. Being able to continue without the perfect word may actually be more useful than knowing the perfect word. And that's something you develop through having real conversations. You don't need to become completely confident before you start speaking. Speaking is part of how you become more confident. And anyway, going back to my original point about my video, this is what I had to remember. It wasn't that confidence suddenly arrived and allowed me to make the video or to publish the video, but I did it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't my best video, but I did it. And it gave me a little bit more confidence to come back this week and to do it again. And it's exactly the same with English. A successful conversation doesn't mean that you spoke perfectly. Maybe it means that you said something when previously you would have stayed quiet. You explained an idea even though you couldn't go into every detail. Or maybe you admitted that you didn't understand rather than pretending that you had. Or maybe you forgot a word and just kept going anyway. Every experience gives you a small piece of evidence. Evidence that you can cope with a pause or a mistake without falling apart. Evidence that your English doesn't have to be perfect to be valuable. I think this question of perfection has become an even more interesting subject in the world we now live in with artificial intelligence. AI can produce polished English within seconds. It can correct your grammar. It can reorganize your sentences, and it can replace ordinary vocabulary with more sophisticated words. And it can be really useful. I use AI myself. But if the purpose of communication were to create flawless sentences, then a machine could already do that more quickly than you and I. But we don't have conversations to exchange perfect sentences. We use language to be curious, to disagree, to tell stories, to make somebody laugh, to offer comfort, and to explain things that matter to us. We use it to connect. What makes a conversation meaningful might be the question somebody chooses to ask, or the way they listen, their warmth or their humour, or exchanging an idea that you'd never really considered before. AI can improve your sentence, but what it can't do is improve your reason for saying it. It can't replace your experiences or your curiosity or your particular way of looking at the world. Those are things that make you worth talking to, not whether you remember to use the present perfect. Of course, accuracy still matters. If a mistake stops somebody from being able to understand you, then it's really useful to learn how to communicate the idea more clearly. If you need your English for a specific job or qualification or situation, there may be special things that you need to work on. But a conversation isn't a competition in which the person who makes the fewest mistakes wins. You're a person using another language to communicate. Your accent reflects the language or languages that you speak. Your pauses probably just mean that your brain is doing the complicated work of finding and organizing language in real time. And your mistakes don't make your ideas less valuable. So when I say that your English may already be good enough, I don't mean that it's finished. None of us have finished learning how to communicate. I mean that you might have enough English already to begin participating. You don't have to improve more first and then use it later. You can improve by using it. So instead of judging your entire English level, ask yourself, what would I like to be able to do in English? Then look for one small opportunity to begin doing it with the English that you have now. That might mean asking a question instead of staying silent. Or it might be sending a voice note. Or it might mean having a one-to-one conversation with somebody like me. So when I think about last week's video that I nearly didn't publish, I think, yeah, it's not a great video. But it did something that the idea of a perfect video couldn't do. It got me making videos again. It made me encourage me to make this video. And perhaps one English conversation could do something similar for you. And that's the kind of space I try and create in my one-to-one conversation sessions. They're not formal lessons or tests. We have genuine conversations about things that interest you. I give you plenty of time to think and to express your ideas, help you when you need it, give you some feedback, and allow you to make mistakes without feeling foolish. I work particularly with intermediate to advanced speakers of English who understand a lot, but find it harder to access that English in real-time conversations, or simply don't feel like themselves when they speak. And you don't need to become confident before you book a session. The session is somewhere where you can start building confidence. If that sounds like it's something that might help you, then you'll find the link to my website in the description below. I hope today's video resonated with you a little bit. If you enjoyed it, make sure you like and subscribe and turn on the notifications when you want to be notified of my next video, which will be published next week because, yeah, I'm getting back into the habit of making regular videos, even if they're not perfect. Hope to meet you soon. Take care. Bye.